The cellar smelled of damp stone and old apples when the lid finally gave. A rust-eaten ammo can rocked loose from the mortar, and in the flashlight beam lay 2 dark tags on a chain, the letters pressed shallow by time W. H. Harper. The tin clicked against the concrete when I turned it, and somewhere above us, a door sighed on its hinges, like the house itself had been holding its breath for 80 years. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. Before any of that, before basements and flashlight beams and the small sounds that can turn a man back into a boy, we lived our days in Ridgeline by the clock tower and the coal whistle. My mornings started the same way they do now, a walk down Maple Street to the Veterans Memorial with a rag in my back pocket, a thermos of coffee warming my palm, and the flag folded just so. The memorial sits on a little knoll 11 steps up from the sidewalk, and you can see the whole town from there. The brick schoolhouse, the water tower with last winter's paint half flaked away, and beyond them the low dark rim of the ridges that gave this place its name. When the air was still, you could hear the coal trains groaning 5, sometimes 6 miles off, the sound slipping along the creek like a steel brush through snow. We had a rhythm, then church bells on Wednesday nights, the high school band working the same Sousa marches every Thursday, the VFW chicken dinners for $3 a plate when payday lined up with good weather. If you walked Main Street at dusk, you'd pass porch lights popping on in a slow wave one after another until the street looked like a string of patient stars. Folks here didn't speak loudly or quickly. We were people of nods and handshakes, of need a hand with that, and I'll settle up Friday. Doors stayed unlocked until long after the 10 o'clock freight shrieked through. Billy Harper was one of ours long before the Army took his measure. He had a way of leaning his shoulder into a conversation so you knew he was listening, even if he only said, "Yes, ma'am," or "I got it." As a boy, he'd sit cross-legged under the big oak behind his parents' garage, scribbling in a little brown book, while the rest of us scuffed baseballs into the dust. He'd wave us on with a grin and come back later with his jeans clean and a new pencil nub shaved down to the wood. His mother, Darlene, kept a metronome on top of the old upright in their front room and taught scales to half the town in the evenings. You could tell who had a lesson by who was carrying cookies on a chipped plate across the lawn. His father, Hank, kept his cap pushed back on his head like he planned to tip it every few minutes and mean it. By the time Billy turned 22, all the boys his age had gone to uniforms or factory shifts. He chose the airborne when the recruiter came to the American Legion with a glossy poster of a man stepping into the air like there was a floor under him no one else could see. Some nights that winter I'd find him on the Harper porch swing, polishing a harness buckle with a square of cloth, working the metal in slow circles while his mother's piano counted time through the open window. If I asked how the jumps were going, he'd tell me it wasn't the fall that got you. It was the ground coming up, and then he'd smile as if he'd told a joke just for himself. Ridgeline measured life in small decent tasks, mending a fence, digging out a ditch before a storm sweeping coal dust from the back stoop. Early June of '44 brought clear mornings that warmed quick the creek low enough to skip stones against the far bank. The paper on my stoop gave us Europe in black and white maps, arrows circling cities I couldn't pronounce, and a handful of names from our county printed in the kind of bold that means suffering. Along those days, Billy came by the Historical Society twice to rummage the back drawers for an old topo map he remembered from school. He laid my magnifying lens on it and traced a finger over a tangle of lines where the hedgerows must have been, then shook his head like the ground over there wouldn't behave under a ruler. His last weekend home before England was plain as bread. Darlene made meatloaf and buttered potatoes because he asked for them, and Hank stepped out twice during supper to blow his nose in the yard. We sat out front afterward, the 4 of us, with coffee sweating in mugs and the chimes knocking under the eaves whenever the breeze found us. When the 9:15 bus rolled by, a few of the church kids inside pressed their hands to the glass like they knew they were catching a small piece of goodbye. Billy started to say something and then let it go. He just reached into his pocket and set that brown notebook on his knee. "Helps me think," he said. He didn't read from it. He didn't have to. The way his fingers squared the corners told me he carried more than a book. At the Legion Field on Sunday, Hank crouched behind the plate in his catcher's gear, and I watched Billy stand at short talking easy with the second baseman like the game might last forever. He wasn't the loudest shout after an out, but he was always where the ball needed him. After we ate ice pops while the grass turned the ankles of our socks green, and I walked him to the edge of the parking lot. He told me he planned to keep his head low and his feet moving, and that he'd send his folks a card as soon as he hit the far shore. When he hugged me, his shoulder bones felt like corners of a frame, strong and spare. The town took his leaving the way it took everything quiet, sturdy, with a plate of cinnamon rolls wrapped in wax paper and a Bible verse tucked under the string. The women from church jammed jars of jam into Darlene's arms until she laughed and nearly dropped them. Pastor Ellis prayed on the front lawn in a circle of neighbors, and Hank, who kept his thoughts fenced off from most people, squeezed my shoulder once and looked away. There was no speech. Ridgeline didn't do speeches. There was freight to unload and a roof to patch, and a boy a few houses down learning his G scale from Mrs. Harper because his parents couldn't afford lessons, and she never took a cent from them anyway. At the train depot that last night, the platform boards creaked under us as if remembering every set of boots that had crossed them since the county was new. It was cool for June, maybe 65 by the thermometer bolted beside the station window, and the stars were low and fat with humidity. Billy carried a duffel that looked too big for him from a distance and just right close up. He hugged his mother first, long and careful, and handed his father the little jar of machine oil he always kept for the mower, like it was important to leave things ready for the summer. He shook my hand and then pulled me in with the kind of grip that says it isn't just a handshake. "Watch the old place for them," he said. It wasn't a favor. It felt like a plan. His letters came regular for a while after he shipped out. Plain talk mostly about food that tasted like tin and a wind off the channel that found its way through everything. He asked about Mrs. Keegan's garden and whether the groundhog under our shed ever surrendered to my traps. He didn't mention fear, but he didn't pretend to be bigger than it either. In one note, he asked me to send a pocket-sized book of Psalms if I could find one, and a handful of No. 2 pencils with good erasers. I mailed both with a postcard of the courthouse clock tower, knowing the old brick would look right to him in any corner of the world. A week later, he wrote just one line under the return address. "Tell Mom the piano sounds the same in my head." I kept that one in the desk at the Historical Society because it felt like Ridgeline distilled quiet music where someone saw only a plain room. There were small signs the ground was shifting if you knew how to listen. Hank started lingering by the radio after supper, tuning the big dial slow as if he might warm a station into existence by patience alone. Darlene moved her lesson schedule earlier in the day, saying the evenings felt longer than they used to. The metronome clicking softer, slower, as if it were embarrassed to keep count. On Main Street, men at the barber shop started leaning in over the newspaper a little closer each morning, not to read the headlines so much as to listen for the spaces between them. And I began to find myself at the memorial more often than I meant to be polishing bronze letters that didn't need polishing, and wiping the small chips from the granite's edge because it felt like the right thing to do with hands that couldn't do a damn thing across an ocean. Sergeant Patrick Doyle crossed my path once just long enough to fix a hinge on the Harpers' front door when it started to drag. He was sharp-eyed without meanness and spoke low the way a man does when he's used to telling people to move and having them move. He kept his visit short 20 minutes on a Saturday, and when he left, he tapped 2 knuckles against the doorframe like a promise. Later, I found a scrap of notepaper on Darlene's desk, a few words in a steady hand. "He's well, training hard, proud of him." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. It was the kind of sentence that props up a whole afternoon. The air had a green edge that final week before the storm, the kind that builds over the ridges and makes the creek smell like turned stone. We kept to our tasks. I mended the rope on the flagpole and wheeled fresh paint across the memorial steps. Hank greased the bearings on my trailer axle and wouldn't take anything for it. Darlene switched out the curtains in the front room for the light ones with the lace edge like she was inviting summer to come a little sooner. At dark, the porch lights blinked on up and down Maple Street, dots of amber steadied by habit and love, and if you walked slow, you could smell the sweet scorch of pie crust from 3 different kitchens cooling on racks. That's what I remember most about those days, the good ordinary weight of them. There was one small thing that didn't sit right at the time, the postcard from England. Billy's neat block letters tied along the margin had a smudge near the stamp where he'd pressed down too hard with his pencil. Under the printed postcard, faint as a thumbprint, he'd written and rubbed out a word, then written again. I didn't notice until later, but the ghost of it is still there if you tilt it under the lamp, home erased, once written harder. It isn't much. It's probably nothing. Still, sometimes the smallest marks tell the truth before the truth arrives. The nights just before June felt longer than any others. The news on the radio thinned out into rumors and then into a silence that had weight to it. Men on porch steps stared across yards without seeing each other, listening for something they couldn't name. The creek slowed to a whisper and the bats came out from under the church eaves in a tight black confetti. Every evening I counted the steps to the memorial in my head before I climbed them. Not because I needed to, but because a clean number means the world has edges you can hold. On June 5th, the sun slid low and copper over the ridge, and the air cooled quick low 70s, dropping into the 60s, soft enough for a light jacket. I set the flag for the night, tied it with the short knot so the midnight wind wouldn't wake it. Across the street, the Harper's porch lamp hummed a faint halo on the glass. Darlene had left her music open on the piano rack, a simple hymn marked with a paperclip. Hank's cap hung on the nail by the door brim, worn where his thumb found it every time he reached. I walked home slow with the thermos knocking softly against my leg, and the town breathed around me the way a body does when sleep starts to take hold. When I stepped onto my own porch, the phone sat still on the hallway table, black and patient. The cord curled just the way it always curled. I set the thermos beside it and listened to the night. One train passed far off and faded. A dog barked once and thought better of it. The porch light on the Harper's house stayed on steady as a star, and the phone did not ring, not yet. I lay in bed with the window open an inch and counted the freight whistles that never came, the seconds between them stacking into a kind of prayer. Down the street, the Harper's porch lamp kept its small circle of gold on the steps until morning, untouched like a promise, waiting for the feet that hadn't returned to climb them. It was the kind of quiet that feels wrong. The night before had been so still that when dawn finally came, it startled me. I woke to the coal train pushing through the valley, the sound rolling slow and hollow, and for a moment I thought it was thunder. When I stepped onto the porch, the air had that heavy sweetness of early June, like rain wanted to fall but couldn't decide when. Across the street, the Harper's porch light was still burning. That alone should have told me something. Darlene never forgot to switch it off. She kept a rhythm tighter than any clock. But that morning, the bulb hummed above her steps, stubborn against the daylight, while the flag at the corner of my yard hung limp as cloth in a drawer. By mid-morning, word started traveling down Maple Street the way it always did, quiet, one porch at a time. Hank had stopped by the post office to ask if anyone had heard updates from Europe. The clerk said a friend of her cousin in Harrisburg mentioned heavy fighting on the beaches, something big enough to end or begin everything, no one could tell which. Darlene didn't say much. She stood by the piano, hand resting on the closed lid while the radio hissed through static. The newsman's voice cracked like it was coming from underwater. "Allied forces have landed in France," he said. Heavy resistance reported. Then silence. Nothing about who, where, or how bad. Just that small sentence hanging there, shaping the day before anyone understood what it meant. I spent that afternoon at the Historical Society pretending to sort through old photographs while the radio beside the front desk kept jumping between songs and war bulletins. Every few minutes the announcer's tone shifted and I'd freeze waiting for the sound of Billy's name or any name from our town. None came. Only coordinates and code words Utah, Omaha, Airborne, Normandy places that meant nothing and everything at once. Around 3 o'clock I saw Hank through the window walking up the street, his hands jammed in his jacket, though the air was warm. He stopped by the memorial, climbed the steps, and stood there long enough for the shadows to crawl across the grass. When I went out to meet him, he just nodded once. His eyes were fixed on the horizon like he was waiting for something to rise from it. That night, the letters started. Telegrams, mostly brown envelopes with block print, some addressed to the families on our street, some to others across town. Missing in action, killed in combat. Each line brief, official, and unbearable. I helped Pastor Ellis deliver 2 of them, walking behind him as he read the names out loud to be sure he'd got them right. We didn't have to knock. Folks knew what it meant when the pastor came up the walk after dark. I prayed with one mother until she fell asleep sitting upright in her chair, the telegram still folded tight in her hand. When we reached the Harper's house, no one had come for them yet. Their light was still burning. Hank was outside by the garage smoking a cigarette to the filter. I didn't ask. I couldn't. Days passed like that, letters and rumors, all half true and heavy. I saw Darlene at the market one morning buying flour. She didn't need her shoulders straight, voice calm. When she reached the counter, she set a slip of paper next to the coins. "If there's word, send Franklin over." That was me. I kept it folded in my pocket like it could make the difference. By the second week of June, official word reached Clearfield County. The 101st had dropped behind enemy lines before the beach landings. Some units had been scattered by cloud cover and flak. They said it was confusion, not catastrophe, though no one believed that. I went to the library after work and studied a map pinned under glass France, all green lines and dots, and tried to imagine where a single man could disappear in all that. Billy's name was printed in the local paper's casualty list on June 12th. Private First Class William Harper reported missing. I kept staring at the word missing. It didn't sit right. Dead, you could understand. Missing was like trying to hold smoke. A week later, Darlene called me over. She'd received a small parcel from the Army, one of those heavy envelopes with the red stamp across the corner. Personal effects. Inside was his pay stub, a few coins, and the ribbon for a Purple Heart issued in absentia. The letter said he was presumed killed in action. That word presumed hung in her kitchen like a smell you couldn't scrub out. She set the envelope on the table, then covered it with a dish towel as if it were indecent to look at. Hank sat silent at the window, his eyes following the road out front but seeing none of it. The piano in the corner hadn't been touched in days. That evening, after I got home, I couldn't shake it. I sat at my desk with the porch door cracked and the radio low. Between the news reports, there was a strange transmission, just static, a click, then a single line spoken so faint I almost missed it. South Road blocked heading east by the orchard. Then nothing. It repeated once more before fading. Later I'd learned that phrase had been recorded over the regiment's open frequency around the same time Billy's name first appeared on the missing rolls. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe interference. But I wrote the words down anyway, the pencil shaking in my hand. Something in the voice felt familiar, calm, almost too calm. Weeks turned into months. Normandy fell. Then France began to breathe again. Soldiers came home in pieces, some whole, some not, but none from Fox Company had word of Billy. I asked around, sent letters, even phoned the regional office in Harrisburg, where a clerk told me politely to stop calling. "These things take time," he said. "Missing can mean a lot of things." I told him I knew that already. By late August, summer had gone brittle. The creek ran low and the fields turned the color of straw. One morning, while repainting the trim at the memorial, a boy from the paper came running up the hill with something folded under his arm. He said a patrol had recovered a rifle near Saint-Côme-du-Mont marked with Billy's unit number, and that was all the Army had told them. I took the paper and read the story 3 times, but there wasn't much there. Just equipment recovered, no remains located. I looked at the boy and asked him not to mention it to Darlene until I could talk to Hank. When I walked home, the sky felt close, pressing down like it wanted to rain again but couldn't manage it. I spent that night at the Harpers. Darlene had cooked soup, but none of us touched it. Hank finally said what none of us wanted to hear, that the blood they'd found near the rifle might have been Billy's. He said it in the kind of voice that isn't asking for a response. Darlene stood up, walked to the piano, and opened the lid. The metronome ticked once when she brushed past it. She pressed a single key, middle C, and left it ringing through the room until the sound thinned out. Then she said softly, "He's not gone." I'd know it if he were. I didn't argue. I just sat there, the soup cooling between us, watching the porch light flicker through the window glass. Months passed that way, small routines filling the silence. I mowed their yard, fixed the porch railing, wrote letters for Hank when his hands trembled too bad to hold a pen. The town moved on the way small towns do, slowly, unevenly. New names went up on the memorial. Darlene kept teaching piano. Hank stopped going to the Legion. And me, I kept wondering about that voice on the radio, that clipped line about the orchard, because every time I replayed it in my head, I could hear him breathing at the end. Alive. Then years later, the world quieted. The war turned into books and anniversaries, medals and folded flags. The Harpers aged, and so did I. But Billy's story didn't fade. It just settled into the corners of memory, too heavy to move, too unfinished to forget. I thought that was where it would stay until one hot afternoon last spring when a package arrived at the Historical Society from a small village in Normandy. The letter inside was written in careful English by a French historian. They'd been restoring an old farmhouse south of Carentan, she said, and while clearing the cellar, they'd found an American ammo box buried under a collapsed wall. Inside were dog tags, a hand-drawn map, and a small notebook bearing the name W.H. Harper. I sat there holding that letter while the fan hummed overhead and the town clock struck noon. 80 years had gone by. The last thing I'd expected was for him to speak again. That night, I drove out to the Harpers' old place. The porch light still worked, though no one had lived there for a while. I stood under it the way I had the night before the invasion, the same bulb casting the same small circle of gold on the steps. Inside, the air smelled faintly of varnish and sheet music. Darlene's piano was still there. The keys yellowed, but waiting. I set the letter on top of it, careful not to fold it. When I got back home, I poured a drink and read the translation again, slower this time. The historian wrote that the journal began on June 7th, 1944, the day after his unit dropped. The first line was plain: "I'm not where I was supposed to land." The coordinates placed him miles south of his intended zone, deep in enemy territory. He'd written about traveling alone, avoiding both Germans and Allies, about a hidden path through marshland and orchards, and a phrase that sent a chill through me, even though the ink was faded nearly to dust. The way out exists. I read that line over and over, trying to hear his voice in it. It didn't sound like surrender. It sounded like purpose. I didn't sleep much that night. The moon hung low over the ridge, and every time I closed my eyes I saw the porch light across the street and the empty chair where Hank used to sit. I thought about all those years the family had waited, all the prayers that ended with silence. And now, somehow, through paper and dirt and distance, Billy had found a way to reach us again. By morning, I'd already written back to the historian. I told her who I was, what he'd meant to this town, and that I'd come to France myself if she'd let me see that journal. She replied 2 weeks later with one line that made my chest tighten. "Then you should come, Mr. Avery. The story is not finished. I read it out loud in the empty office, and the sound of it filled the room like a promise. I didn't know then what I was stepping toward, only that I owed it to him, to the boy who once wrote poems under an oak tree and vanished into cloud and fire to follow where he'd led. When I locked up that night, the streets of Ridgeline were quiet again. The summer air smelled of rain and coal smoke. A single bulb glowed across the way, lighting the Harpers' old porch like always. And I remember thinking, maybe it wasn't just habit that kept that light burning. Maybe it was waiting. Because some stories don't end. They wait for someone to walk back into them. I landed in France the way you step into a photograph you've stared at your whole life, everything familiar and foreign at once. The air off the coast smelled faintly of salt and wheat, like the sea and the fields hadn't decided which one owned the wind. It was early spring, a gray morning that held on to its chill. When the train slowed through Carentan, I could see the countryside unfold, hedgerows twisting in tight lines, farmhouses with tile roofs, the kind of quiet that hides its history under green. I'd carried Billy's journal with me in a padded folder, though I hadn't opened it since the flight. Just having it nearby felt like I was traveling with a ghost who finally wanted to be found. A French historian named Elise Moreau met me outside the small museum she helped run near the old market square. She was younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a voice soft enough to draw you closer when she spoke. She led me into her office, a narrow room stacked with folders and coffee mugs, and set the journal on the table between us like it was a living thing. The cover had gone stiff with age, its corners dark from the oil in a man's hands. The ink had faded to the color of old tea, but the writing was steady, deliberate. She'd already translated much of it, but some lines were still uncertain, half in code, half in plain speech. "He was trained to write like this," she said, tapping the page. Every mark meant something. I spent the next hours turning the pages, slowly breathing in the faint scent of paper that had lived underground. The first entries were what I expected, coordinates, notes about enemy patrols, sketches of the countryside, but somewhere around the third page, the tone shifted. The sentences grew shorter, sharper, more personal. He wrote about seeing lights at night that didn't belong to any army, about villagers who spoke in riddles, about a woman who appeared from the dark carrying bread and a small pistol. Her name came later, written as though he was afraid to write it wrong, Colette. I remember touching that name with my thumb, thinking how easily a person's whole existence can fit inside a single word. Elise watched me read. "You understand?" she said quietly. "Most soldiers who went missing here, there's no trace left. This," she gestured toward the open book, "this is very rare." She told me that the map tucked into the back of the journal matched no known Allied records. It marked landmarks. No modern map carried an orchard trench, a chapel ridge, a place labeled only as La Porte d'Ombre, the door of shadow. Her team had already started retracing the path drawn there. He was heading south, she said. Always south. That night, I stayed at a small inn on the edge of town. The owner was an old man who remembered the war only through stories his parents told, how paratroopers dropped like stars gone wrong, how the sky flashed red for hours. I lay awake listening to the creak of the shutters, the hum of the streetlights outside, and tried to imagine Billy somewhere beyond those fields, moving quietly through a world on fire. The last line I'd read before bed kept circling in my head. The way out exists. At dawn, Elise and I drove out to the farmhouse where the journal had been found. The road curved past low stone walls, ditches thick with grass, and wheat fields that rolled for miles. She said the cellar was discovered by accident. A mason had struck something metal while repairing a foundation. Beneath the debris was the ammo box, sealed in oilcloth and mud. When she unlocked the cellar door and the smell of damp earth hit me, it was like stepping back 80 years in a single breath. We stood in the dim light, the air cool and still. You could see where the wall had caved, exposing a small hollow lined with loose stones. That was where the box had rested. I knelt beside it, running my fingers along the mortar, and wondered how many storms had passed above without disturbing it. Sometimes, the world protects what it isn't ready to give up. From there we followed the first coordinates marked in his journal. The land was uneven patches of old road swallowed by roots and moss. Elise had a copy of his map folded in her pocket edges, taped from use. About 2 miles south of the farmhouse, we found what he'd drawn as a spiral symbol. It was carved into the bark of an oak tree, the grooves deep, but softened by time. I traced it with my fingertip, feeling the ridges. It wasn't graffiti, not random. The carving was too deliberate, almost ceremonial. "We've found 2 others like this," Elise said, lowering her camera. "One near the ruins of a chapel, one closer to the river." We walked on. The forest thickened until daylight became something thin, filtered through layers of green. Every now and then the wind would move the branches, and you could hear them groan like old wood in a church. I thought of Billy again, alone, carrying that journal, trying to make sense of a place that seemed to exist between maps. What had he been running from? Or toward the chapel ruins appeared near noon, half sunk into the earth-stone walls covered in ivy. Inside, the floor was scattered with broken glass and dried leaves. In one corner, carved into a fallen beam, was the second symbol, a triangle with a line through its center. I brushed the dust off, and beneath it, half hidden by moss, was something small and round. Elise bent down and lifted it carefully. It was a button, tarnished green, stamped with U.S. Army. She turned it over in her palm, silent for a long time before whispering, "Someone wanted this to be found." We ate lunch sitting on the low wall outside the countryside, stretching out quiet and endless. The only sound was a distant tractor working a field, its engine carrying faintly through the wind. I asked Elise what she thought he meant by the door of shadow. She shrugged. In French, ombre can mean shadow, but also shelter, a place hidden from light. Maybe he meant safety. I nodded, though something about the phrase felt older, like he'd written it to himself more than anyone else. That evening, she showed me one more entry she'd translated just that week. It mentioned Colette again, the woman he'd met in the ruins, the one who seemed to guide him. "Follow me," he'd written, "but forget your name." The line unsettled me, not because it was strange, but because it was so human. War has a way of erasing people. Maybe forgetting was the only way he could survive it. Elise told me they'd found records of a woman matching her description, Colette Fournier, 24, a courier for the local resistance. Her last known report was dated June 12, 1944. After that, her name disappeared from the lists. Over the next few days, we kept following the trail south. The symbols reappeared, spirals, arrows, lines etched into stone or tree bark. They led us through gullies and along narrow riverbeds where the mud still smelled of iron. Each mark felt like a whisper from someone trying not to be forgotten. I started to imagine their voices in the quiet Billy's careful tone, Colette's French whisper guiding him through the dark. It wasn't madness. It was memory filling the space where sound used to be. One afternoon, we reached the burned remains of a farmhouse marked on the map. Only the stone threshold stood upright. There, carved into its base, was a doorway drawn in perfect perspective, shaded dark. Around it were faint outlines of figures too faded to identify. Elise took photos, but we stood there a long time after not speaking. There was something reverent about it, like stepping into the edge of a story that never wanted to end. That night at the inn, I sat by the window with the journal open, reading by the yellow light of a desk lamp. Billy's handwriting had grown uneven toward the final pages, letters leaning into one another as if written in haste. He spoke of tunnels of symbols that glowed faintly in the dark, of whispers in the earth. He sounded tired, but not broken. "I'm not lost," he wrote once. "I'm being led." I closed the book and looked out at the dark fields stretching toward the sea, the stars faint behind clouds. Somewhere beyond that horizon, he'd walked the same path I was on, every step carrying him further from the life he knew. When dawn came, Elise called me downstairs. A farmer she'd spoken with had mentioned an old estate on the edge of the forest, mostly collapsed now, but known locally by an old nickname, the Shadow House. The name was coincidence, maybe, but it matched the word on Billy's map. We drove there before noon, the tires crunching over gravel that turned quickly to dirt. The estate was nothing more than a skeleton of stone walls wrapped in ivy. Birds nested in the chimneys and wildflowers grew through the cracks in the courtyard. Behind what once might have been a stable, half hidden by brambles, we found it a shallow trench filled with debris and a rusted hatch underneath. Elise brushed away the dirt until the iron shape appeared. It was heavy cold to the touch, fused shut by decades of rust. When we finally pried it open, the smell that came out was like a long-forgotten cellar earth water and something older. The air rushed upward, damp and heavy. A black opening yawned below us, the stairs descending at a shallow angle into the dark. I leaned over the edge with my flashlight. The beam reached maybe 20 feet before it hit stone. The tunnel walls were lined with moss, slick with condensation. "You wanted to find him," Elise said softly beside me. "This is where it starts." I didn't answer. I just listened to the wind moving through the trees above us, to the faint drip of water echoing from below. We marked the site and sealed it again until her team could bring the right equipment. As we walked back to the car, the sky broke open with a slow drizzle, the kind that settles into your collar and doesn't let go. I kept thinking about the last page of his journal, the one I hadn't shown her yet. The line I couldn't shake. The door is real. That night I lay awake in my small room listening to the rain against the window pane. Every sound seemed to come from underground, the rhythm of water on stone, the low hum of wind pushing through gaps in the roof. It felt like the earth was breathing, remembering. I thought about how close we were, how every answer seemed to wait just beneath our feet. And before I drifted off, I caught myself whispering his name the way you do when you're not sure who might be listening. The morning we went back to the estate, the air had that stillness you feel right before a storm, the kind that makes every sound sharper. Dew clung to the grass, and the forest beyond the crumbling walls looked darker than it had the day before. Elise's team had arrived early, hauling down lighting rigs, cameras, and gear. I stood off to the side, watching them work, trying to convince myself this was just another excavation. But deep down I knew it wasn't. The journal had brought us here word by word until there was nowhere else left to go. That rusted hatch behind the stable, it wasn't just a piece of history. It was a door to the last place Billy Harper had ever written about. When the seal finally broke, the hinges let out a sound like a slow exhale, metal on stone. A smell came with it. Wet earth, cold metal, a trace of something sweet and rotten like old apples. The first light cut down into the dark, catching the slick walls and the outline of stairs leading away from us. Elise adjusted her flashlight, nodded once, and started down. I followed close behind, one hand on the stone one, clutching the rail. Every step we took echoed. Water dripped somewhere deep ahead. I remember thinking the air felt old, like it hadn't been touched since the war ended. The tunnel was narrower than I expected, maybe 3 feet wide, just enough to move single file. The walls were laid brick, the mortar soft and crumbling under our gloves. After 20 yards, we found the first sign of him, a helmet lying on its side, cracked along the rim. The number stamped inside matched the issue for the 101st. Next to it sat an empty ration tin, the label half rotted away, but still faintly legible, June 1944. I knelt beside it, brushing away the dust, and tried to picture his hand setting it there. Maybe he'd stopped for rest. Maybe he'd dropped it running. The deeper we went, the more it felt like the ground was closing around us. Moss crawled along the lower stones, and the temperature dropped a good 10 degrees. On the right wall, we found the same carved symbols from his journal spirals arrows and that strange triangle with the line through it. But now they looked newer than they should have. Not recent exactly, but better preserved, as if the air itself had protected them. Elise took photos while I kept my flashlight steady. When the beam hit the far side of the passage, it landed on something else, blackened paper plastered against the wall. I peeled it off carefully. It was a fragment of an old newspaper dated June 14th, 1944. The headline in French spoke of Allied forces pushing toward Cherbourg. He must have had it with him, maybe found it in a village and carried it down here. Further in the tunnel, split into two directions. One path had collapsed under rubble, the other sloped upward toward the faint sound of running water. The team decided to follow the open route. The ground turned slick under our boots. About 50 feet in the passage ended at an iron gate welded shut with rust. On the wall beside it, in what looked like charcoal or burnt wood, someone had written a name, Fournier 44. I didn't need Elise to translate it. Colette's signature. I can still remember how quiet it got after that. Everyone stopped talking. We just stood there, flashlights shaking in our hands, the sound of the river humming faintly behind the gate. I looked at that name until my eyes blurred. She'd made it this far. So had he. The thought should have comforted me, but instead it filled me with a strange kind of dread, because if they'd reached this point and never came out, then somewhere beyond that gate was where the story ended. Elise crouched beside the writing, tracing the letters with her gloved fingers. She knew this place, she said softly. The tunnel was real. The realization hit us both at once. This wasn't legend or superstition. It had been part of something deliberate. Not a random hideout, but a system built for escape. Back above ground, the rest of the team stayed to secure the site, while Elise and I went through her research files at the inn. She'd been digging into old Allied records and mentioned one phrase that kept appearing in the margins of declassified notes Operation Phantom. It was barely documented, one paragraph here, a reference there, but enough to piece together the edges. According to British SOE papers, it was a covert initiative during the spring of 1944. The plan was to use local resistance networks to create hidden extraction routes for compromised operatives' routes, so secret that even if the mission failed, no one could trace them. No names, no maps, no acknowledgments, just disappearances written off as losses. That phrase, "no one could trace them," stuck with me. Maybe that was what Billy had stumbled into, or maybe he was chosen for it. Elise wasn't sure. What we did know was, his journal wasn't just a record of survival. It was evidence of a hidden system, one that might have worked too well. Later that night, I unfolded the letter tucked behind the final pages of his journal, the one addressed simply Ma. I'd read it a dozen times already, but under that dim lamp the words felt heavier. He spoke of exhaustion and guilt, not for fighting, but for surviving. He wrote about the woman who'd helped him, the way she taught him to move unseen, to breathe through fear. She showed me the path he'd written, not just through the woods, but out of the noise. Then came the line that caught in my throat every time. If you're reading this, I hope I found my way out, not just of France, but of the war. I don't know how long I sat there staring at that sentence. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the gutters still whispered with leftover water. Elise came down from her room just before midnight, a file in her hand. "You should see this," she said. It was a faded black and white photo of a small group of resistance fighters standing outside a farmhouse, their faces blurred by motion. One of them, a woman, tall hair pulled back under a scarf, looked like Colette. Her name was handwritten on the back. The photo had been taken 2 weeks before D-Day. It was the last known record of her alive. We spent the next day combing through archives, piecing together whatever fragments we could find. Colette had been part of a resistance cell operating under British coordination near Caen. Her task was to guide stranded Allied soldiers out of occupied zones, often through old monastery tunnels or smuggler routes dating back centuries. Most of her group was captured or killed by late June. Her file ended abruptly with no record of arrest, execution, or escape. She'd simply vanished. And now we knew why. Her last trail ended in that tunnel. As the days passed, a picture began to form. Billy wasn't just lost behind enemy lines, he'd been absorbed into something larger, a hidden route that never made it into the official history books. Whether he volunteered or stumbled into it, he became part of Operation Phantom, a ghost network meant to erase itself. When I thought back to the tone of his last entries, they didn't sound like fear anymore. They sounded like surrender not to death but to secrecy. Maybe he understood that what he'd found had to stay hidden, that survival meant disappearing completely. I tried to imagine him writing that final letter by the light of a small lantern, his hands dirty, his voice steady. He wasn't running from duty. He was following it someplace no one could follow. The following week, Elise received a message from a contact in London. They'd located a single classified note referencing an American courier attached to Operation Phantom last sighted near Carentan in June of 1944. The description matched Billy's service record. It wasn't proof, but it was close enough. Someone had known about him, and they'd chosen silence. On our last evening in Normandy, Elise and I returned to the estate. The sun was low, the sky painted with thin streaks of orange. The hatch was sealed again, but the site felt alive now, like the earth itself had exhaled a secret it had been keeping for too long. I stood by the stone wall where his map ended, and thought about that young man from Pennsylvania who'd once written poetry under an oak tree. He'd gone off to fight a war, and somehow found a way to walk right out of it. Before we left, Elise said something that stayed with me ever since. You realize she told me if he did make it out, he never would have gone home. Not after something like that. He'd already crossed a line no one was supposed to cross. I didn't answer right away. The evening light stretched long shadows over the grass, and for a moment I thought I saw movement at the edge of the woods, just a trick of dusk, maybe a bird cutting through. But it felt like a presence quiet and watchful, the way memory sometimes stands beside you when the story's not done yet. That night back at the inn, I packed the journal last. I slipped it into the case with the same care you'd give a living thing, then sat on the edge of the bed listening to the wind rattle the shutters. I couldn't stop thinking about that iron gate under the earth, about the name written beside it, and the river that still whispered beyond it. Somewhere out there, their story hadn't finished ending. And for the first time since I'd started chasing his trail, I realized I didn't want it to, not yet. I came back to Ridgeline in late autumn, the kind of season where the air turns sharp and every sound feels like it carries a little farther. The hills were fading to rust the oak behind the Harper house bare, except for one stubborn branch that refused to let go. I hadn't been home since the trip to France. Everything here looked smaller, quieter, as if the town had folded in on itself while I was gone. The old Veterans Memorial stood exactly as it always had, the bronze names burnished from years of weather and hands that still traced them every Memorial Day. I ran my fingers along the column marked 1944 until I found him Private First Class William Harper. The name hadn't changed, but I had. Because now, after all these years, I knew he wasn't a ghost lost in battle. He'd walked into something bigger than any of us could have imagined, and somehow he'd found a way out. Elise and I stayed in touch after I left Normandy. The excavation at the estate continued through the summer. Her team cleared the tunnel inch by inch until they reached the river's edge. Beyond the rusted gate, they found an opening to a narrow channel where the water still flowed cold and steady. There were no remains, no uniforms, no trace of the two people who'd left their names carved in that place. Just an old canvas strap rotted beyond recognition, and the faint outline of a footprint preserved in silt too large to belong to Colette, too defined to have been left by time alone. They sent me photos, and I studied them for hours. You can convince yourself of anything if you stare long enough. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was both of them side by side. Maybe that was where they crossed out of the war and into whatever came next. A few weeks after I got home, Elise forwarded another discovery. A photograph found in a private archive in Geneva, 1952, the platform of a busy train station. At first glance, it was nothing just travelers caught in mid-step, but near the edge of the frame, a man stood alone, collar turned up, a leather satchel at his side. The archivist labeled him as E. Hartman Zurich. I didn't need the computer scan to tell me who he looked like. The face was older, leaner, the eyes set deeper, but it was him. The scar above the brow, the way he stood, shoulders squared, watchful. They said the match probability was 94%. To me, that number didn't matter. It was enough just to see the possibility. There were no records of that name, no tax filings, no obituary. Just a ghost who lived quietly in Switzerland for a decade and vanished again. But in one of his known addresses, they found letters written in French to a woman in Marseille. The handwriting looked like Billy's, tight and deliberate, the way he wrote when he wanted his words to last. The letters never mentioned war. They talked about fishing boats, changing weather, and a garden that never seemed to take. If Colette had lived, if she'd found her way south, I like to think she was the one writing back. Two people who had already disappeared once, still finding ways to speak to each other in secret. The official agencies didn't know what to do with the information. You can't resurrect a soldier without proof, and the army doesn't rewrite walls of marble. So his name stayed carved in stone, the same as all the others. Darlene Harper passed away before any of this came to light. She never knew about the journal, never saw the photographs. Maybe that's mercy. Hank outlived her by a few years, long enough to see his own name added to the Legion's roll of honor. On his last evening, a nurse said he kept asking someone to turn the porch light on. I think he was calling his son home in the only way he knew how. When I told the town what had been found, people gathered in the church hall to listen. The younger ones came out of curiosity. The older ones came out of duty. I laid the journal on a table under glass, open to the page where he'd written, "The way out exists." I told them what we'd uncovered, the tunnel, the gate, the letters, the photograph, and I watched the faces around the room shift between wonder and disbelief. When it ended, no one clapped. They just stood in the hush looking at that journal like it was something holy. A month later, I returned to the memorial and added one small line beneath his name on a brass plaque, believed to have survived the Normandy campaign, fate unknown. It wasn't official, but it felt right. Truth doesn't always fit the paperwork. Sometimes it lives quietly in margins and rumors and letters written by candlelight. In the years since I've had time to think about what he did, or maybe what he chose not to do, he could have come back. He knew where home was. But I think after walking through that tunnel, after losing everything familiar to noise and blood, maybe the idea of home became something different. Maybe peace meant letting the world believe he was gone. I used to wonder if that was cowardice. Now I think it was courage of another kind, the courage to stop running toward war and start walking toward life. Elisa's research grew into something bigger. With the family's permission, she founded a small organization called Paths of the Forgotten, dedicated to uncovering hidden routes used by the resistance. The first site they restored was that tunnel beneath the estate. They cleared the entrance, reinforced the steps, and left a small bronze plaque at the mouth that reads, "For those who walked unseen but never in vain." She sent me a photograph of it last year, the hatch-open sunlight streaming down into the dark. I printed it and keep it framed on the desk at the Historical Society. When visitors ask about it, I tell them the story of a young man from Ridgeline who jumped into history and found his own way out of it. Sometimes I think about him the way he was before all of it. The boy under the oak tree with the notebook, the one who wrote poems about the sky being too wide for small-town dreams. In a way, he got what he wanted. He saw the world, wrote his story, and became part of something larger than the war that tried to swallow him. Not a hero in the usual sense, no medals, no parades, but a reminder that survival itself can be its own kind of victory. I've walked that trail of his symbols again through the hedgerows and fields of Normandy. The carvings are fading now, the trees thick with new bark, but if you look closely you can still make out the spirals, the arrows, the triangles. Sometimes I bring visitors, sometimes I walk alone. The air down there smells the same damp earth and moss, time standing still. When I reach the river, I stop and listen. The water moves slow but steady, as if carrying stories too heavy for the ground. It's easy to imagine two silhouettes stepping out of the dark and into that current, leaving everything behind. People like to ask me if I think he lived. I tell them I don't know and maybe I don't want to. What matters is that he found a way to keep his soul intact even when the world around him forgot how. Whether he died in that tunnel or built a quiet life under another name, the war didn't take all of him. And maybe that's the real ending. Every year on the anniversary of the invasion, I polish the memorial plaque. The letters catch the sunlight for a few minutes before the clouds move back in. And every time I see his name there, I don't picture him on a battlefield anymore. I picture him walking along a quiet riverbank somewhere free of uniforms and orders a notebook in his hand, the world at peace around him. When I finish the day's work, I usually walk home past his old house. The porch still leans a little, the paint faded to a pale gray. But that light above the steps, it still burns. Some neighbor must keep it going out of habit, or maybe out of something closer to faith. Either way, I never ask them to turn it off, because in some small way, that light feels like the right ending. A single circle of warmth against the dark. Proof that someone made it home, even if it wasn't the way we expected. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for numbers, but so no one's name, not his or hers or anyone who vanished quietly, ever gets lost to the dark.